The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week, we're going to turn back the clock to the early 20th century and look at the career of Eddie Collins of the old Philadelphia Athletics. Between 1911 and 1914, Collins was the second baseman of the famed $100,000 infield and helped the A's win World Series titles in 1911 and 1913 and another American League pennant in 1914. He also finished third, sixth, and first in the Chalmers Award voting, then the Most Valuable Player Award. When A's manager Connie Mack broke up the team after the 1914 season, he sold Collins to the Chicago White Sox for the then record $50,000. Collins continued his outstanding play in Chicago, leading the White Sox to the 1917 World Series title. In 1919, Collins hit .319 and stole a league-best 33 bases in leading the White Sox back to the World Series, a team known forever as the Black Sox after 8 players were accused of throwing the ball classic. Collins was never implicated in the scandal. Collins continued to thrive with the introduction of the Lively Ball in 1920, posting batting averages well over 300. He also managed the White Sox from the end of the 1924 season through the 1926 season. In 1925, Collins became just the 6th person to join the 3,000 hit club and the last for the next 17 seasons. He is also one of only 4 players in modern baseball history with more than 500 steals and a .424 on-base percentage, which ranks 11th among modern players. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1939. Well, those are just the statistics. To give us a more in-depth understanding of Eddie Collins, however, the man, as well as the player, is this week's guest, Bill Huhn, author of Eddie Collins, A Baseball Biography, published in 2008 by McFarland Books. Welcome to the podcast, Rick.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Rick, your interest in Eddie Collins began in a idiosyncratic way, a card game. How did that interest become passionate enough for you to write a biography of him?
Well, it's interesting. It was kind of a coincidence. I was working on a book about George Sisler, a biography of George Sisler, the old St. Louis Browns first baseman, a great ball player, Hall of Famer. And I came across a photograph of George and Eddie Collins. I hadn't seen a photograph of Eddie Collins in years. I was familiar with him, and his career, as you've capsulized, is fairly well known if you're a real baseball history aficionado. And the photograph kind of clicked in my mind because when I was a kid, I used to play a game. I always pronounced it the Kadako All-Star Baseball game. I might not have pronounced the company's name right. But anyway, it was a little spinner game where you put a disc of an individual player on the game board, and you spun, and where the spinner landed, it would have a number, a given space on the card that would tell you a little bit about whether it was a base hit, what kind of a hit it was, or an out. And I remembered that Eddie Collins' card in that game was really an outstanding card. He didn't hit a lot of home runs. It was a very small space for that, but a lot of doubles, a lot of singles, a lot of stolen bases, a lot of sacrifices. And I started thinking, when I get done with this Sisler book, I might want to take a crack at Eddie Collins, because I checked and nobody had ever written about him. So that's really how it started, a photograph of George Sisler with Eddie Collins back probably sometime in the late maybe 1915 to 1925 era. And that got me started, Bill.
Mm-hmm. You know, despite the fact that Collins' career statistics show that he's one of the top, if not the best ever second baseman in the game, you know, he's largely forgotten by baseball writers. And you point out in your book that the closest anyone ever came to writing his biography was Jim Leonard, who collaborated with Collins on a 5-part series of his life published in the Sporting News. So why do you think no one ever wrote a book-length treatment of Collins until you?
Well, in fact, the 5-part series in the Sporting News was in 1950. And when I started looking into it, it was already around 2006, 2007. So you're talking 57 years. I think that there was some similarity because nobody had written a book about George Sisler either until I decided to write one. And I think they were similar players in some aspects, and that is they were terrific players, but they were not controversial players. Eddie Collins was involved in a lot of controversial matters, such as the Chicago Black Sox scandal in 1919, but he was not a figure in that. He was on the team. He was not central to that particular scandal. He was a member of many World Series teams and played very well during those series, but nothing controversial ever happened. He didn't kick up a lot of dust during his very long career in baseball, which continued on even after he was done managing and playing with the Athletics in the late 1920s. He went on to a long career as a general manager with the Boston Red Sox, but he was not really a central figure in controversy, and I think for that reason, probably biographers kind of passed him by, and he almost became a forgotten person, even though, as you just pointed out, he was always considered one of the very top second basemen in baseball history. Always, any list I've ever seen, he's in the top 2, 3, maybe not even below 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, controversy seems to drive the narrative of many baseball books, especially in the mid to late 20th century.
That's for sure.
So that's understandable. Collins was one of the first of Connie Mack's college recruits. He came out of Columbia University, but he didn't play so well for the A's, playing under a pseudonym at the age of 19. That pseudonym was Eddie Sullivan in 1906. Why did Mack keep him?
Well, I think he saw in Eddie Collins or Eddie Sullivan, as the case may be. And by the way, that name was used and even suggested by Connie Mack to try to help preserve Eddie Collins' last year of college eligibility at Columbia. But anyway, I think he saw a really lively bat. Eddie Collins, he could tell he was going to be a hitter. He just didn't know where to play him at first. And so when he came up, he only played in a handful of games. I believe it was 1906. And when he came back the next year, the problem was trying to find a place for him. And when there was criticism about keeping Eddie on the team, Connie Mack would always say, well, this guy's a hitter, and we'll find a place for him, even if for now he's just going to be a utility player. And that's what he was, I guess, up until maybe at least 1907 into 1908. A little bit after that, then during that year, they started using him some at second base, and that's where he finally prospered. He was a terrible outfielder, not a very good shortstop, and his bat was what was keeping him in the major leagues at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I really like about your book is that Collins' personality comes out. You have a real nice way of describing it. In fact, you mentioned that early on, when you were a youth, you saw a picture, maybe it was a daguerreotype or something of Collins, and he looked like a graceful athlete, and then years later you saw another photograph of him, and you're saying to yourself, is this the same guy? It looks like he, is for all intents and purposes a nerd. And he did have a reserved, rather gruff personality, and he was also extremely confident, a trait that earned him the nickname Cocky. probably because he was one of the very few college-educated people in the majors at that period of time. But in all these ways, Collins was the complete opposite of the more popular Danny Murphy, who he replaced as the second baseman in the $100,000 infield in 1907. How did the other members of that infield feel about the switch?
Well, at that time, the infield that became the $100,000 infield, Frank Baker was Home Run Baker, is his nickname, was at third base, and Jack Berry was the shortstop. But I think Harry Davis at that point was the first baseman. Of course, Murphy had been playing second base. And as you said, Murphy's a very, very popular player with the team and with the fans. So it could have caused some problems, but Murphy was a good guy. I think when he went out into the outfield, I believe about that time, Connie Mack appointed him as captain. So I think the team accepted the fact that he was going to be made captain and have a place on the team. And as Connie Mack would say, Danny Murphy was a good hitter. He wasn't really a great second baseman. What he did, though, at first was kind of cushion a change. He had another ball player play a few games at second base before he finally installed Eddie Collins into the lineup. And so I think that helped. That kind of diffused the situation. And also Danny Murphy was the kind of player that put team first and really did a great job as an outfielder. And I don't think they missed that. In fact, they prospered at that point once that infield came together. Then a couple years later, Stuffy McInnes took over at first base, and I believe that was right around 1911 or so when they started calling this group the $100,000 infield.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sounds like Mack cushioning the blow by putting an interim replacement in there at second base.
Sure.
Very astute move. Rick, you already talked a little bit about the 1919 Black Sox scandal. The early 20th century really was a time period where there was great concern about gambling and fixes in baseball. Some historians, including myself, believe that the A's threw the 1914 World Series to the so-called Miracle Braves. If so, Collins would have been a member of two teams that threw a World Series, though, of course, he was too ethical to participate in the fix. Two questions. First, do you think the 1914 A's threw the World Series? And second, if Collins suspected or knew about the 1919 fix, as you suggest from his remarks later on in life, he did, because Gandil apparently approached him, why wasn't he banned from baseball by Commissioner Landis?
Okay, I'll take your first question first, and that's the 1914 World Series with the Boston Braves. I did not find any credible evidence during my research for the Collins book that the World Series had been thrown. I did note that at one point Eddie Collins wrote, and I'm not exactly sure the time frame for this, that he felt that Chief Bender, the star pitcher for the 1914 A's, had lost interest during the series. And, of course, that could be interpreted in a number of ways, but I did not feel that that was Eddie Collins' assertion that there had been anything like such as what happened in 1919 where the players actually threw the World Series. So I didn't find anything. I did notice and wrote about in the book the fact that the A's were not playing very good ball as the year wound down in 1914. They weren't at their best as far as their results of their games. They weren't hitting or pitching as well as the A's teams of those last 4 or 5 years, and that the Braves were really playing lights out baseball. They had as they call them, the Miracle Braves, for a reason. And so when I took that together with the fact that later on, when Eddie Collins was the manager of the White Sox, he actually brought Chief Bender back as an assistant coach or a pitching coach for the White Sox. And even later on, if I remember right, Connie Mack even brought Bender back to the Athletics in some capacity years later. That I just don't think that they threw that World Series. I think they could be accused of bad baseball, but not that. Mm-hmm. Now, your second question was about the 1919 White Sox. I don't recall that Chick Gandil, the first baseman, who was probably pretty much the stated ringleader for the 1919 White Sox players that were involved in the scandal. I don't think that he approached Eddie in 1919. My memory of that is that he approached him in 1917, an incident where the White Sox players, and this was through Gandil and a couple of the other players that he ran around with, determined that they wanted to reward the Detroit Tigers for a series where they beat Boston when in 1917 the pennant race was still alive. And so they took up a collection of, I think it was $45 a player to buy a suits for some of the the Detroit players. And at that point, Gandil approached Eddie Collins, he approached Ray Schalk, neither of which wanted to do it, but reluctantly went along with it. And at that time in baseball, even though it was not something that was encouraged, sometimes teams would do that. They would buy something to kind of reward a team for something they did, and it wasn't looked upon as it is now. You'd be out of baseball if you did something like that. So, but Gandil and Collins were not speaking, so I don't know at that point, after 1917 on into 1919. In fact, Eddie wasn't speaking to any of those players that were involved in the scandal. They had a real split among the White Sox players, especially in 1919. So I think the comments that Eddie made and that you're referring to after the 1919 World Series, Eddie would go back and forth. And if you look at it, there are some comments Eddie saying he didn't really know what was going on, and he was as surprised as anybody. And other stories I read, and where he would say that he was aware, people were aware of this, and he was aware that something was going on, maybe not to the extent that it happened. But my theory on this, Bill, is that the fact that, if you recall, Buck Weaver was banned for baseball, even though he didn't participate, or there's no evidence that he participated in throwing games, for knowledge and having sat in on meetings before the game. And my thinking is that Eddie and some of the other White Sox players that were not involved in the scandal directly were worried that if they said anything or indicated a lot of knowledge of this, that Judge Landis, the commissioner of baseball, might also bring them within the scope of his ban, and they might not be able to play baseball going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's kind of a long answer. I'm sorry, but in order to explain that, I think I had to go into a little bit of detail there.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the highlights or lowlights, if you will, of Collins' career. And when I used to talk with his son, Eddie Jr., about that issue, he kept on dismissing it by saying, well, his father really didn't like to talk about that World Series, and it just left a real bad taste in his mouth. So at least at home, he didn't say much at all about it. So, I commend you on your research. I thought that part of the book was very well written.
Thank you.
You know, you referred to Collins' 3 years as a manager of the White Sox, and he really didn't enjoy the same success as a manager as he did as a player. During that 3-year stint as manager, all with the White Sox, he compiled a record of 174 wins, 160 losses for a .521 winning percentage, and he never finished higher than 5th place. Why the lack of success?
Well, I think that as the 1920 season wore on, and the players that eventually were indicted from the 1919 series, what became the 8 men out, so to speak, several of those players were still playing in 1920, but after that season, and when the indictments came down, the White Sox were very much in the pennant race. Taking those players out, players like Joe Jackson and Buck Weaver and Happy Felsch and the 2 very fine pitchers, Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams, out of that White Sox lineup, really gutted the team. And so even 5-6 years later, when Eddie was taking over, he actually was late in the 1924 season, and then 25 and 26, and on through after Eddie was relieved of his duties, Ray Schalk took over. Even up until 1959, the White Sox never won another pennant, and this had been a team that won 2 pennants in 3 years and was on the verge of winning their 3rd pennant in 4 years when the indictments came down in 1920. So I think that he was, and many of these other managers were victims of a team that was decimated by player, you can't say player defections, but player loss, and because they were banned from the game. And so it just took an awful long time to recover from what happened in 1919, and I think he was a victim of that. I did feel that he still had a future in managing, and I think Connie Mack felt that because he brought him back in 1927 as sort of a part-time baseball player, but also the word, and I saw it several times in Philadelphia papers, that he would be the heir apparent when Connie Mack retired. And, of course, as we all know, Connie managed for many, many years after 1927. But I don't think that they would have felt that way about Eddie had they felt that he was a failure in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mack was an innovator in many respects, baseball. One of them was bringing veterans back to help cultivate and mentor younger players. And in 27, of course, he brought not only Collins back, but he also signed on, I believe, Tris Speaker, Ty Cobb, and Kid Gleason. And, of course, they played at the very beginning of the season and near the very end of the season, 27 and 28. And then by 29, that young group of kids, so to speak, Lefty Grove, the pitching ace, Jimmy Collins, Mickey Cochran, all those guys, Hall of Famers, future Hall of Famers, were ready to take the reins, and and Mack had his second championship dynasty, 29-31. Instead of moving back to a managerial position, though, Collins moved on to Boston as the general manager of the Red Sox, and that's a position he kept from 1933 through the 1947 season. Now, although he turned the Red Sox into a contender, he also refused to sign black players, including Jackie Robinson, who had tried out for I want to be careful when I say this. Did he try out for the Red Sox, or I think it was the Red Sox. He had a tryout for the Boston Braves, too, but it was canceled because Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away, so they say, and they had funeral services. But this is something, interestingly, that this aversion to black players is something that he had in common with the Phillies general manager, Herb Pennock, who happened to be related to Eddie Collins through marriage. Herb Pennock's daughter married Eddie Collins Jr. Did you find any direct evidence that Collins was a racist?
I did not find any direct evidence of that. I did conclude in my book that Eddie was a baseball establishment type. If you look into the background of Eddie Collins, even though his family was not a wealthy family, his father held a nice position as a train master with the railroad in the New York City area. But Eddie had grown up in Tarrytown, New York, and his family either through their own means or possibly scholarships, because Eddie was a bright young man, he attended the Irving Institute, which was an exclusive boys' school in the Tarrytown, New York area. That's a city just north of New York along the Hudson River. And he was actually very, very, very much a part of the establishment when he went on to Columbia University, a fraternity man, and all this. And my feeling was that baseball through those years when the tryout took place was not going to accept a black baseball player, and Eddie Collins was not going to rock the boat. And so in that instance, I didn't find any direct evidence. In fact, Eddie, when he was playing college ball, played some ball up in summer league in Vermont, and his team played against a team that had several African American baseball players on it. There was a lot of controversy. I found all kinds of newspaper articles about controversy and all that, but Eddie was not involved in that and played the game with no problems at all. So I can't say that I have any evidence of that other than the fact that he was definitely an establishment type who was not going to rock the boat. Had he taken a step forward and gone that route, we might be talking about Eddie Collins and not Branch Rickey today as the man who helped break the color line in baseball. But he wasn't that type of person.
Mm-hmm. Rick, you wrote the book, 10 years ago.
Correct.
In retrospect, what did you learn about Eddie Collins in baseball during the time that he played? Were there any surprises, anything that shocked you about his career or baseball at that period of time?
No, nothing in particular. I did find it very interesting, the relationship that Eddie had with Tom Yawkey. Tom Yawkey was younger than Eddie. Tom was, for those who don't know, was the longtime owner of the Boston Red Sox. But Tom Yawkey had gone to school at the Irving Institute and kind of looked up to Eddie. Eddie had been a major personality as he went on into Major League Baseball and became pretty famous and as a baseball player. And Eddie was idolized by Yawkey, and so when Yawkey bought the Boston Red Sox, he brought Eddie over, and Eddie actually became a part owner, to my knowledge, about 10% owner of the Boston Red Sox when he took that GM's job there. And I just always found that interesting, the stories about the close relationship between the two of them. And I do know that Tom Yawkey has been criticized quite a bit for not bringing black baseball players to Boston. They were one of the last, if not the last, team to integrate. And so, it does give pause, but as I said, I've never been able to establish that Eddie had any specific racial tendencies. And he was, as you pointed out, a very good friend of Herb Pennock, not just through marriage. I think Herb Pennock and Eddie were probably best friends. And I know Herb Pennock has taken a lot of flack over the years for his stand, which was a much more, I guess it would be much more publicized stand during Jackie Robinson's break-in years, that first year that he was going through playing the various teams around the National League circuit. So I guess, I found a little bit more of that as time has gone on, but nothing really other than that. My perception of Eddie Collins is he was a guy who was all businesslike, went about his business. I don't think he was involved in any of the scandals with the Black Sox scandal at all. He, in fact, was the leader of what has come to be known as the Clean Sox, and quite an interesting ball player. And I was really pleased to be able to bring him to light a little bit with my biography.
Listeners, it's an excellent book, Eddie Collins, A Baseball Biography by Rick Huhn, published by McFarland Books. You could purchase it online at www.mcfarland, McFarland, pub.com. Rick, thanks for being with us, and thanks for writing such an insightful book on Eddie Collins. I really do believe that you've finally given him his due.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. The pleasure was mine. I enjoyed talking to you tonight.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, Past, Present, and Personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.